What does belonging mean to you personally in 3 words?
Don't sacrifice yourself.
Oh shit, that's
Oh,
good.
that's so good.
That's good. It's good. It's good.
Hey, friend.
Hey, Mel, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. Yeah. A couple months ago, Enzo figured out that when you whisper to Alexa, she whispers back. Well, this weekend, we found out that if you ask Alexa to fart, she does. And
What?
she has, yes, she has a whole canon of various farts that she will fart on demand for you, which, yeah.
This
So that
is
was,
incredible, and now I know what to teach my 6-year-old nephew when I visit Florida in a few months.
you're welcome. I give you that gift. I give you
I
that gift.
appreciate it.
Yeah, that was my
Appreciate it.
Saturday. How was your weekend?
It was lovely. Thank you. It
Yeah.
was so nice and sunny here. I'm just enjoying spring, but I'm in the thick of wanting to throw everything out of my house. I just get in that mode
Yeah.
of get a dumpster. Let's throw it all out.
Yep. Yeah. That always feels good when you do that. And then
Yeah.
4 months later, you're like, "Wait, where the hell is that
Where did
thing?"
that sweater go?
Yeah.
Well, friends, we're so excited because we're launching our episode with Dr. Beth Kaplan, who is a global expert in belonging.
Mhm.
And she is on a mission to improve belonging in the workplace, in general, in the world. And she joined us to talk about it. Francesca, what did you think about this episode?
Yeah. There were a lot of pieces of this episode that felt very personal. Like, I have felt what she had been talking about, and I've also felt when I haven't.
Same. I also felt just validated and really appreciated gaining some new insights and tools that I can take with me to
Yeah,
help my own feeling of belonging, but help others' feelings of belonging as well.
yeah, she was so good and gracious about offering small but really impactful things that everybody can do, whether you're an employee, a manager, or honestly, you're leading a company.
Yeah. So,
Doesn't have to be
yeah,
big. Doesn't it, small things, big difference,
small
right?
things. Yeah, it's baby steps. Well, everyone, here's Dr. Beth Kaplan. Friends, we are super excited to have with us today Dr. Beth Kaplan. Beth helps companies create a culture of belonging. She's also interested in how workplace trauma impacts our well being and our future of work. And she's been recognized as a world leading expert on belonging by the University of Pennsylvania. And she's collaborating with them to develop a groundbreaking tool to measure belonging. She is currently the global head of leader development and enablement at Dassault Systems. Lastly, she is an author, and her book, Braving the Workplace, will be coming out soon. Beth, so lovely to have you here with us at your work, friends. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Yeah. Tell us, what is belonging? How do you define belonging?
So, belonging is the innate desire to be part of something larger than ourselves without sacrificing who we are. So, often I get the question of what's more important, the first part of that second sentence or the second, and they're both equally as important, right? So, we've all had this overwhelming desire to be social, to be part of something. But if it comes at the cost of who we are, it's not real belonging.
I felt that. I think I felt that before. Francesca, have you felt that before?
Yeah, I literally just got chills when you said that, even though I've heard you say that before, Beth, but then when you said it again, I'm like, oh shit, that's so true. It's so,
Right?
yes, I felt it. Yeah, the opposite of belonging is really fitting in, trying to change who you are for other people.
Yeah. And it never feels good when you try to force that ever.
Never.
Why does this matter so much in life? It clearly matters. I think, what do they say? Community is actually more important than exercise in terms of life
Yes.
expectancy, right? Why
Yes.
does it matter so much in the workplace specifically?
So it matters for so many reasons. And the true reality of this one is that it extends beyond the workplace. We work so much more than any other generation. You could debate that in history when people used to have to hunt for their food, maybe a little bit different. But at the same time, the reality in this one is that when you're happier, you're more productive. When you're able to connect with the world, and feel like you can be yourself in any situation, you're going to feel that way. It gives you coping mechanisms. The serotonin alone is so healthy for us. When we don't have that, or where we feel isolated or excluded or any of the things, or like we're giving up a part of ourselves, it has very negative real world consequences for us, for our mental, our physical, sociological well being. Now, at the same time, it also takes a toll on everything in the workplace, from retention to all of the different measurements that you can come up with around satisfaction. But it's a real bottom line killer. When people feel like they don't belong, they either stay and they're unproductive, which costs companies money, or they leave abruptly, which really kills your recruiting. And then at the same time, when they're not productive, you lose business, you lose everything there. So the reality is that it hits all parts of the spectrum.
You're obviously extremely passionate about this work. What got you started?
I think it's been with me all along. I think most of us would say that, right? A lot of people will come to me and say that everyone feels like a belonging researcher, or everyone feels like a belonging storyteller, because it's really rooted in our DNA, right? It's part of everything we do. So I'm no different. And for me, I had an experience in the workplace that really prompted me to evaluate how I look at myself. Was I being true to myself? And if I felt like I belonged or not? I'll keep it real. The eventual realization was no, I didn't feel like I was being any of those things to myself. But instead of backing out and leaving, I doubled down. I made things so much harder for myself. So the second I figured that someone didn't like me, who happened to be my boss at the time, it really hurt physically, right? So I think at the time, it was way pre-pandemic, and it was a stage where people weren't talking about things like this. No loud quitting on LinkedIn, right? Or there was no quiet quitting where you could do what you had to do just to get the job done at the end of the day. So for me, I really wanted those gold stars from a boss who was never going to give them. And I put myself in such harm's way that I was contemplating suicide. That's
Mm.
true. And when I told said manager, he ignored me. Well,
Wow.
yeah. So that was a trigger for me to get out. And not everyone's as lucky. You're not able just to pick up and leave when you want to, because there's this little thing called livelihood. Our
Yeah.
jobs support us. So for me, I was able to make the decision that I need to leave. And it took me a good, I would say, 8 months to a year to actually go.
Yeah. I get it. What is that saying? You can't win over people who are committed to misunderstanding you or not accepting you. And especially, I can only speak for myself as a perpetual people pleaser, a recovering people pleaser. It's natural. It's human nature to want to win people over when you
Yeah.
feel like, oh, this person doesn't like me. Why not? And what can I do about it? And sometimes there's nothing you can do about it, but it does
That's not-
really impact you.
Absolutely. And the sad part to me, there's so many sad parts. The saddest part was I was trying desperately to win someone over who I didn't really respect.
Yeah.
I wouldn't take advice from him. Why was I taking criticism?
Yeah.
And it forced me to really look at myself, look outside of the workplace. I was working 60 to 80 hours a week. I was losing friendships outside of work because people gave up trying to get together with me. I was doing things that were harmful, losing sleep, hair was falling out, I was gaining weight. And it was only until he ignored me, formally ignored my cries for help, that I knew I needed to leave.
I'm so sorry that happened to you. I just think it's really beautiful to see someone turning something that is so painful into something that is so powerful, what you're doing through this work. So thank you for that. I'm sure there are thousands of people that have felt very similar to you in terms of feeling like they didn't belong, that they were trying to assimilate into corporate culture, assimilate into the way a leader needed them to act, to only not have that be reciprocated. You've been doing this work and studying this work. So you took that situation and then you went super deep in this.
Yes.
Which is like a leading expert on belonging. I am wondering if we can talk about what are some of those common barriers or challenges people face in the workplace as it relates to belonging. What is that? What is that looking like for a lot of people?
I think it looks very different across the board, right? There's a lot of diversity conversations that go around this. So when I comment, it's probably going to be a little more main sweeping. It'll
Yeah.
hit everyone. I think one of the biggest barriers that we have is this internal talk track that we have, right? There's the story we tell ourselves, and it's not always a realistic story. When we feel bad about ourselves, we beat ourselves up pretty badly.
Yeah.
I think that's a really common barrier that I hear from people. A lot of times the blame that you have is shifted onto you from you because you don't know where else to take it.
Yeah.
Back in the day, I always say that back in the day, it was HR. You'd go to HR, but the definition of HR has shifted. So when people have problems in the workplace, they don't know where to go. You would logically think your manager, but that's not always a possibility,
Mhm.
right? If we think about it, they're unequal playing fields. You and your managers are not equal. That's a reality. So speaking truth to power is really hard. And I think we're at a tipping point where people have been speaking truth to power and we haven't seen it go very well. So I think one of the biggest barriers are our leaders in the workplace and getting them acclimated to what it looks like when we talk about trauma informed workplace. So the trauma informed workplace is really where you see things in the workplace that affect your mental and your physical health. We talk a lot about psychological safety, right?
Mhm.
So when we don't feel safe in our environment and we're witnessing things that we need to either make just or justify on the company's behalf, that can become trauma informed for us, is just one example, really.
Talk more about that.
Mm. So, a few things, not to disparage managers completely, but here's the reality. Have either of you ever had a manager that doubled as a psychologist? No, probably not. In
Uh,
time, that's common. But from the pandemic and on, I believe that managers are being asked to take on way more, including the mental stability and health of their employees.
yeah.
Like there's
Yeah.
a lot of check-ins and things that managers are not able to control. People come into the workplace with a lot of different backgrounds. Some come in and they are happy, healthy, raring, and ready to go. And others, unfortunately, have to fake it till they get there. That's why concepts like family in the workplace are really hard. How many of you have heard anyone in the workplace ever say, oh, but we're like a family?
Ugh, that's a red flag.
It's a red flag because here's the reality. You can't fire your family. I would love to fire some of my family members. That's just not what
And
happens.
most families are dysfunctional.
Most are dysfunctional. But when you equate family in the workplace to your personal life, which role do you think your boss plays in that? Right? A mom and dad.
Yeah.
Very. So people really pay a lot of stock in that, where some are like, no, I get it. Clearly, that's not my familial ties. Others put a big point of, this is me, this is who I am. And their identities start to get taken over by the workplace. So it's not, I'm Beth, the mom of two. It is, I'm Beth and I work at this company
Yeah.
and this is my job.
It's been interesting watching as people are getting laid off.
Yes.
And they're getting laid off from companies that they have been with for 5, 10,
Mhm.
15 plus years.
Yeah.
And one of the things that when Mel and I talk to folks, because we're on calls all the time with people, when they get laid off, it is a grieving process. A lot of times, a deep grieving process because they did associate and identify so hard, not only with the title that they had,
Yes.
but with the company.
Absolutely.
Because I will argue that I think a lot of companies have positioned themselves as you're part of this brand, you're part of this culture, you're lucky to be here, right? When you think about the safety net of your family, if your family were to disown you, you'd feel very similarly. And so I think there's this grief around, quite honestly, having that be ripped from you. And if you felt a deep sense of belonging and then all of a sudden you got laid off too, that does excuse my French, it feels like a huge mind fuck for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. And for a long time, that was very taboo to talk about.
Yeah.
Here's the reality: trauma is trauma. You don't need to be in the fields fighting to experience PTSD. There's a lot of different ways it occurs. Workplace PTSD is a very real thing. So, a lot of the people I coach and I talk to are very anxious to talk to me about it because they believe that their trauma is not as important as other forms of trauma. Trauma can really be as small as a sadness you experience and as large as something physically happening to you in the workplace.
Yeah.
That spectrum is just so huge. I have one person that I talked to recently who had a real hard time identifying the first time that they experienced trauma. And what we were able to bring it back to was their 5-year anniversary came and went, and no one recognized it. At the same time, everyone else on that team got recognized.
No.
That wasn't trauma they experienced, a lot of sadness that led them into this really unproductive zone where they unfortunately they started to put up with more that came their way. You would think it might be the opposite, but they really just were trying again to get those gold stars from their manager who they thought didn't care about them. And what could I have done wrong? In reality, that's something the manager probably forgot. It's sad, right? Maybe the workday alert didn't go off. Who knows? And that's just one of the examples. And that was a spiral that kept going and going. And then the trauma really occurred when they were out of sync with their manager. And then topics of resilience came up. And instead of digging into the deep roots of what was going on in the workplace, resilience was dumped on the employee base. You need to be resilient because
Mhm.
you need to put up with these things, right?
But I find this interesting too, because when I think about belonging, it was like diversity and inclusion. And then it was diversity, equity, inclusion. And then it was diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Yes.
And a lot of the examples you've been giving are right around an employee and their manager or an
Yep.
employee to employee. Yet sometimes in organizations, it seems like we're putting belonging at this corporate level.
Yes.
There's a distance. There's
Yeah.
distance. And I'm curious about your thoughts on belonging in these big corporate initiatives versus
Sure.
belonging the way we do.
So I can break it into two things.
Love it.
One, yeah, belonging is not all or nothing. That's a really big common misconception. You can belong to part of something and not the whole. You may feel like you belong to the company and your team, but not to your manager. Or you may feel like you belong to that manager and your team, but not the company.
Yeah.
You could swap it in and out. And that's why I think ERGs are especially fantastic and troublesome at the same time because you feel fantastic usually in those groups and they're highly beneficial for you to really be able to identify and connect with people. However, that being said, when they don't connect back to the corporate initiative or the company doesn't do anything about the struggles of these ERGs, that's a problem,
Yeah,
right?
it is. Yeah.
People have a harsher or a more thwarted sense of belonging, which means a lack of belonging. Another is that belonging is not DEI. And that's probably one of the biggest. You asked me before, I might change my answer. DEI is a barrier at times to belonging because when you ask people what belonging is in the corporate world, they now say D, E, and I. And they're all very important topics. They're just very different. But I would challenge you to go to any corporate report out there that says report on DEIB, anything that has a belonging. And if you can find me one metric on belonging, I'd be very surprised. It's just not the same. They're sisters, not twins at times. But
How are they measuring it? What are the typical, do they actually, sorry, I should know this and I don't. And
no, it's
I'm
very
happy to
hard to
put
measure belonging. So that's why I'm working with the University of Pennsylvania to create a tool around that. But no, belonging is seen as something subjective. And until we're able to make it more objective, it is very difficult. Unlike diversity, which is typically done through representation, but I would challenge that. I love the topic of diversity, but I really am into diversity of thought and mind. I think it's incredibly important when we're talking about representation as well. So it's
Yeah.
very different in that sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there, right?
A
Like a
lot.
lot of amazing work has been done and the journey
Yeah,
continues. Yeah.
absolutely. I hope it doesn't stop.
You too.
Beth, I'd love to hear more about the work that you're doing with the University of Pennsylvania, the tool that you are working on with them.
Sure. So a lot of the work I do is around how we construct our sense of belonging, understanding what the roots of that are, whether it's personality or it's how you make decisions. And when I was doing my dissertation, oh my goodness, a few years back, one of the things we determined is that people make decisions one of three ways: for themselves, for the company, or for a combination of both. So, as you can guess, the healthiest combination is when you have everything at once. So, most people with a true sense of belonging have that combination. When we do it just for the company, it's typically what we call sacrificial belonging, right? We have to give something up for it. We all know the sacrifices in the workplace, the ones that miss their PTO and then to better the company, or the ones that are missing games to produce those reports. So the other thing is if it's just for you, there's a few different ways you look at that, but it's not always the right way to do things. So what I've done with the University of Pennsylvania is we've developed a tool that looks to see how people make their decisions around belonging. And so what we're doing is really taking a look and working with different companies to see how the reports are coming out, if it's predicting people's propensity to leave companies, or if it's predicting their propensity to thrive based on the way they construct their sense of belonging.
It's really interesting. What have you learned so far with the companies that you've worked with? Were there any ahas that you were like, oh, that was unexpected, or anything that just reinforced what you thought?
We've learned a couple different things. A lot of the time, it's not actually been what's through the tool, but it's really through the interview process about the societal norms of the company.
Yeah.
So, personality makes a very big difference. If you are a company that builds itself upon extroverts and you are an introvert in that company, it's going to be a lot harder for you to progress.
Yep.
Mhm.
Likewise, if you're in an introverted company with introverted leaders and you are an extrovert, it's also going to feel like you are just square round. Doesn't work that way. So I think what we've learned is that companies need to pay attention to what type of employees they have and making sure that everyone can survive and thrive.
Francesca and I talk about this often that in the workplace, the responsibility of a lot of these things are on the individual, the team, and the organization. So I'd love to cover all three from your perspective and the work that you've done.
Yeah.
From an organization standpoint, what are some steps that organizations can take to create that culture of belonging where people are thriving?
There's a lot of ways I could answer this. I think one of the things they need to do is look at their policies. That's the first thing. They need to make it a more equitable playing field. I think that most of us can agree that belonging is typically and authenticity are measured against a very specific type of worker in the workplace. It's usually white male. That's the best way to describe it. The other thing I would say on top of policies is making sure that you do not have a culture of imposed belonging, right? So everyone belongs here. It's not the case. And it makes people feel really bad. There's this concept of duck syndrome. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
No,
No.
please tell us more.
to think about a little duck floating along the river. You probably met like a brisk pace. In reality, that duck is working hard to paddle its legs to look that calm and easy. And a lot of the times, the workplace imposing belonging or saying everyone should feel this way because we make everyone feel included or like they should have a sense of belonging makes people feel really uneasy about themselves. And when that happens, it produces this sense of belonging uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's me or the company. And let's just say you are with people that are not being honest around you. Or worse, you've got the corporate cheerleaders. You're not necessarily going to be like, hey, Francesca, I know you go to every happy hour, but do you feel like you sometimes don't belong here? So I think that's one of the things that we do in the workplace as corporations that needs to be reexamined.
I tell you, I've probably been listening to way too much Taylor Swift lately, but there is definitely this sense of betrayal sometimes, or even companies misrepresenting themselves. And they're like, oh, everyone belongs here, or we're such a fun
Yeah.
culture. When you look at literally the marketing of how some of these companies present themselves
Yes.
and the
Yes.
expectation
Yes.
people have, right? That dissonance when people don't experience it or they feel like they have the duck syndrome, it's got to be exhausting for people.
It is exhausting. And that's not to say that companies shouldn't promote a sense of belonging, but not everyone belongs here.
Yeah, I think
Like the culture we have.
yeah,
And
it's like being more authentic even in their own advertising to say we strive to foster that environment and consistently work towards achieving it, which
yes,
acknowledges that it doesn't exist 100% of the time, but it's a constant effort. I think that's more authentic than what some of the messaging is usually.
absolutely. And you had mentioned the fact that what should companies and the corporate level do maybe versus teams. And
Yes.
if I am a corporation that's looking to foster a stronger sense of belonging, I'm going to invest in belonging at the team level or the org level. Because especially these bigger companies, that's where belonging is really taken out and brought into daylight because the corporate vision and values, they always get a little altered as you go down, right? Different
Mhm.
leaders live those values differently. Organizations reflect that. So taking a look at what my organization looks like and trying to create the best possible culture, the healthiest possible culture, that's what companies can do. Is really acknowledge and give that autonomy to their leaders at the org level. And then that also makes it a safer space for leaders at the team level to be able to do that as well.
Right. What can leaders do in terms of creating those moments? Okay. Really checking in with their people around how they're feeling in the workplace. What are something someone can implement tomorrow, right? And just start doing if they're not doing anything today.
So, one of my favorite things to tell leaders is to really start to know their people. That doesn't mean you know where they live and what their backyard looks like, but it means knowing what's important to them. And one of the best, easiest things that any leaders out there listening can do is they can ask their employees what they liked about their last manager and what they didn't like, because that's really important. I'm pretty sure we're talking about current managers. The reality is, we all take our past managers with us, typically up to three. So that means your favorite manager, you take them with you. Your least favorite manager, you take them with you. And you are measuring that current leader that you're with against those great and not so great leaders. So if you're out there and you're a leader, you're going to want to say, what did you like that they did? What didn't you like? And you're going to learn so much. This year, I asked my team those questions. I usually update it because not everyone feels the same after a year or remembers it the same. But I had said, what do you like that your last leader did? And someone had said they kept consistent meetings. So they didn't move my one-on-ones. And that made me feel really good because it gave me anxiety every time I had to reschedule. And I was guilty. I was one of those people that moved them around. So I stopped doing that. And another thing that someone said that they didn't like was being praised publicly, accepting that kudos was hard for them in public, but they really did appreciate it in a one-on-one setting when you were giving very specific feedback of what they did well. Those are just two tips that are really helpful, at least I find.
Yeah. I love to hear it, just checking in. What are your needs specifically and really personalizing it versus kind of spreading it like peanut butter as if it works for everybody just because
Absolutely.
you think that's the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
It makes me think of that lawsuit that someone had when their birthday was recognized in the workplace, but they didn't want their birthday
Yes.
recognized.
Yep.
And I think that's a perfect example. I know there was a lot of jokes that came with that lawsuit, but I was like,
Yes.
that's so valid though. That's taking care of people and understanding what they do and don't want and paying attention to that.
Absolutely. What's interesting about that story with the employee that didn't want a public praise, he happens to be very publicly admired. So
Yeah.
I just assumed that this is something he was comfortable with, and he was not. And ever since we changed the way we give him feedback and praise,
Yeah.
the whole relationship has been so much more positive.
Yeah.
Well, I love the idea of the ghost of bosses past
Oh,
that
yeah.
we all bring because God, that's so freaking true. It's so true. And that question of what did you love and what didn't you like is so informative because it's so personal and it's so emotional for people too.
So emotional. I actually talked to almost all of my past managers. And so it's also just a good idea to keep in touch and sometimes keep it real.
Yeah.
He likes to tell me when maybe sometimes I'm being a little more dramatic because she's got really great frame of reference for it. Saying that it's not a bad idea. It doesn't mean that you have to be best friends with your bosses. Obviously, your work friends podcast would tell you you're not going to be best friends with everyone, and nor should you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think getting to know your employees is super, super important and knowing how they are as a unit, if I haven't said that already. But understanding what your package deal looks like. That's really important. Knowing my boss knowing why I stop work at 5:30 every day and then why I may go back on at 10 is important to me. I don't want to be seen as a workaholic, but at the same time, it's my comfort level. And I also don't want to miss the time with while my kids are awake.
Mhm.
So I
Right.
duck out. It should be completely acceptable, and it is, but it's probably because we had that conversation and that transparency really goes both ways.
I love that. I'd love to talk about employees because leaders are in there with their people. It gets into one-on-ones and then a team level, but they're not always in all of this stuff happening with the individual employees, that kind of peer-to-peer interaction and what goes on there. And sometimes for folks, leaders are a huge impact to their experience and their day-to-day, but so are their colleagues.
Right.
And sometimes those peer-to-peer relationships can really make or break that sense of belonging as well. What can individuals do to foster belonging in the workplace?
So I would say boundaries are a fantastic place to start because boundaries are the things that we can control. We can't control other people, how they react to our boundaries, and we can't set boundaries for others. So I always like to say that communication is kindness in this regard. and allowing people to understand you a little bit better than they may by understanding what your boundaries are and why you hold firm to them also gives them insight into your values and what's important to you.
What can someone do when they're really struggling with feeling that sense of belonging either on their team? What can they do if they're really struggling to find that?
My first piece of advice I give everyone is to understand if the situation is real or if it's a story they're telling themselves. Our internal narrative is extremely powerful. It
Yeah.
is. And unfortunately, it's usually less positive that we want it to be. I really wish that we were having the conversation where we're talking about someone that had just so much faith in themselves and that they were talking about their narrative. Oh my goodness, I just kicked butt on that demo. Or that's typically not what happens. And there's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty. So I usually tell people, aside from looking at the story we're telling ourselves and making sure that it's realistic, it's also maybe doing a gut check, but against your own mantras in life. So for me, I can share the story that I will typically over index on things. So I try to hold myself accountable to doing what someone's asked me to do and sometimes nothing more, which is really hard for me. And if I'm really not sure about that, I might go to a peer and say, "Did you hear it the same way I heard this request?" Sometimes that makes it a breeding ground to open up a little differently with people. And it also cuts the drama down because you don't want to just have that friend that you commiserate with at work. And that's real easy to get into that trap. If you have another person, it's the drama triangle. So it just keeps going and going. We want to make sure that when we pick coworkers that become our friends in the office, that it's people we can trust and that you typically want to limit any of the difficult conversation within that person that you trust. Personally, I love to be friends with everyone, but when it comes to people that I really will bank on, I usually maybe pick one person that maybe knows a little bit more drama about me than others. Maybe
Yeah,
it's
someone who can also help you check yourself
oh,
if needed, right?
keep it
And have
real.
that honest, yeah. Is that true? Just asking, is that really true?
That's right. I
Yeah.
couldn't agree more.
There's a huge push in workplaces around bringing your authentic self. How can folks balance that need for individuality
Mhm.
with their desire to fit in so they can be authentically them and bring and maintain that individuality while also feeling that sense of belonging?
So I think the first step in doing that is understanding your values and what's important to you. So when you make decisions, you're indexing against them. Let's just say you notice bad behavior in the room, you have Black colleagues that are not being heard, and diversity is a huge value to you, equity is a big value to you, and amplification. If that's something that is going to keep you up at night, you need to speak up. I mean, let me just say that to me, that is a huge value. So to me, that is inherently doing the right thing. But that being said, if that's going to happen, just because other people are not amplifying their voices, it is part of my value system that I would need to be the one that stands up and says, Mel just said that. Or I love how Mel just told us that we are
Right.
use the vending machine on the fourth floor. I don't know. I have no good examples.
This often happens to women, right? In meetings
Yes.
where you need to step in and say, that was a great point made by so and
Yes.
yeah.
That's right. And so I think understanding what your values are, and I don't like the negative metaphors, but understanding what a hill we're dying on is for us and what's not. Not everything has to be a battle.
Right.
So there are a lot of us that have the sense of justice in us and understanding what battles we should be fighting and not. If it's going to keep you up at night and it's going to eat at your soul because you've just betrayed yourself, it's worth speaking up.
Yeah.
If not, one of the tricks I do is I typically hold 3 coins in my pocket. And when I'm in a meeting, I make sure not to spend all 3 at once and not to speak more than that because it's going to be really hard for me to tailor back. And so giving yourself strategies when you know you may be in a tough situation, really key in the workplace.
Yeah. I like that. And the 3 coins in your pocket is a nice reminder for
Yeah.
folks. That's a very simple tactic to use. Very,
It's also sensory if you think
yeah.
about. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
I am wondering about different ways of working. Obviously, COVID really blew up how we work, which
Yes.
is fantastic in so many ways. And now you have return to office and people who are in the office, and you have these hybrid working environments, and some are still 100% remote. Would you approach ways to foster belonging differently based on the modality of how people are working?
So COVID was terrible, but one of the things we got out of it is this ability to see people beyond the screen. And I think that's really important. I've always been a remote employee, so I knew I was to people, I was just sitting in this box here. And then when COVID happened, everyone was put in that position. And I think it made people reevaluate where people work from and the fact that it didn't really matter. I will tell you that there is this concept of place belongingness, and place belongingness really sits with the fact that if it feels like home, it can be linked to a place. I've never been in a corporate headquarters where it's felt like home. No one serves me coffee, so no baristas at my house. That would be lovely. Like sometimes it happens in the workplace, and that's a luxury. I think that people have a misconception that you need to be in an office to feel a sense of belonging. And I don't believe that's accurate. And the research tells us it's not true.
What does the research say about that? Because you hear all of these big organizations, a huge part of their argument for return to office is it's going to foster belonging. We've
Yes.
lost belonging. And it feels like that's such a false narrative. What does the research say?
The research says that unless it feels like home, it doesn't necessarily need to be place belongingness. That being said, do I love to get together with my colleagues? I do. I'm one of those people that does, but that is because I'm an ambivert that leads towards the extrovert side. So I get so much energy from other people.
Yeah.
Yeah. The reality is that's not how everyone is. They've got a lot of extroverts that are wonderful talkers, wonderful doers, but they get their stimulus from other places, and that's okay. So while I do believe that people build a great sense of community while they're in the office, I do. It doesn't necessarily have to be done that way. And I'll tell you, almost all of my team and my organization that I manage is remote. We get along fantastic. We don't always agree. We love disagreeing. We love the debate, but it doesn't break our sense of belonging to be remote. I do think there are certain jobs where that collaboration in person is important, right? But I just happen to be in a space where it's not as firm. And we believe that working from the office could also mean you're at a client or other places where you are set up and need to have those interactions. But no, it does not give you a stronger sense of belonging to be in an office.
We have, I think, what, four, now maybe five generations in the workplace,
Yes.
which impacts so many things. We
Yeah.
talk about individualization in their needs and that personalization. How do generational differences, and especially in the time we're in now, like how does that impact belonging in the workplace?
So we have a lot of generations at once. As you mentioned, right? You've got the boomers who really will challenge less when it comes to management and authority because your job and your boss are sacred in a sense. And you've got the Gen Xers who are still a little more likely to please. I'm a Gen Xer, but at the same time, will take far less to get it done. And we're not necessarily the purpose driven generation that is currently in the work, coming up in the workplace, where they've been taught that they can bring their authentic selves to work and they should hold people to standards that are different than maybe the millennials that came before them, that a little bit more different change in the way that we work. So I think all of those generations together learn from one another. I think in the beginning it felt a little problematic, but I think it's forcing people out of their comfort zone, which helps everyone grow just a lot differently than we have in the past. I would go as far as to say that the next generation will be probably Generation T, which is all around transition
Yeah.
and how we deal with the world and look at it differently. So I honestly think all of this is bringing phenomenal diversity of thought that didn't exist necessarily before.
Couldn't agree more. It just seems like it's a really good conversation that seems to be happening among everybody about how to make work better together.
Absolutely. And these were things we weren't talking about before. So
Yeah.
it is very interesting. We're also getting into different things that we didn't before when it comes to these generations. Like we have grandparents now in the workplace. And if you think about it, before people would retire early or than they do now. So you didn't have that frame of reference. You have people working longer than they ever have. And these shifts in generation and family responsibility are really shaping a different way that we look at the workplace.
I'm personally completely for it. Outside of like humans being humans, there's no reason why we shouldn't have been striving for a very deep sense of belonging all along. It's exciting to see this evolve, especially over the last, I'd say, 5 years, where it's been a big part of this discussion. I do want to talk about where is this going? But before I ask you that,
Yeah.
and I really appreciate having your insights in this because you're so researched on it. You're a practitioner of this. I feel like you're the best person to ask this question. And I'm going to ask you to give a grade scale A, B, C, D, F, right? Corporate America.
Mhm.
How well do organizations in corporate America foster belonging?
In America, B minus.
B minus. Rationale for the grade?
Rationale for the grade? Because a B is positive, but depending on how you look at it, some people think it's really negative in this culture of perfectionism that we have,
Mm,
and others are completely satisfied by it. I thought about dropping it down, but a C being average, I still think it's a bit above average because the awareness layer is there. That's
yeah,
really, I don't talk to people and have to talk about why belonging is important anymore. It's
they
just
know.
confusing to people about what it is and how we got to where we are with it. So I'd
Uh-huh.
say solid B minus.
I like that answer. I like that answer. I feel like most employees would answer that too.
I'd agree. I usually think that people are going to answer lower and they don't.
Huh.
I think
Uh,
a lot of it also is because people are nervous to tell the truth. They
yeah.
are
Yeah.
nervous it's going to get back to their employer.
I also am wondering because there's such a morphing of our values towards work too. I wonder if people are
Mhm.
taking the pressure off of organizations to be everything to them. Now I'm looking at this more transactionally, or I'm looking at this as Mel, I'm sorry, I'm going to use this analogy again. I'm not looking at you as someone I want to marry. I'm looking at you as someone I want to have a good time with tonight.
Yeah.
So it's like the pressure's off a little bit.
My hope is because people realize they don't have to get their sense of belonging from work.
Yeah.
So we have this concept of dissimulated belonging where you don't necessarily need to be a cultural ambassador. Some people just want to do their jobs and go home. Yeah.
That has to be okay. We
And
have
that's
to make that okay.
and I think
Yes.
this new generation does that
Yeah.
in a sense for us. So I want to say that's becoming a bit more mainstream that people don't need to get their satisfaction and their purpose from work.
Yeah.
And that's the generation I think that we'll see come in as well.
I
It's
love
so
that.
healthy.
Yeah.
That's such a new healthy outlook because we're all Gen X on this call.
Yeah.
You know how like that was a transition I think we probably all made over time. But it's nice to see that people are not putting moving away from putting their whole identity into the work.
Absolutely. And then there's these companies that are shifting their values to be really about the work they're doing and not necessarily the destinations for belonging, which is huge. The company I work for, I have to say, I'm proud because we really do look at powering smarter treatments for patients. Okay. So if you really break that down, that's a phenomenal aspiration. And we really work very hard to it. You would never say in our values that we have to feel a certain way or do a certain thing or act the way to get there. And for us, that takes a lot of pressure off of things.
Yeah. I also think it's an accurate representation.
Yeah.
This is my thing. Can we get back to accurate representation? I'm not judging you on what you're saying you are. What I'm asking you to do is be honest about who you are. So you give an accurate representation. That's my
Like,
thank you for coming to my TED Talk. All right. So this is exciting. Mel and I were talking about this the other day. Because I don't know about you, Beth, but you feel the energy shifting, especially this year around work, around speed, around change, around everything.
yeah.
And belonging has made wonderful progress in terms of educating people about value, what it is.
Mhm.
And I'm curious about when we look at the next 5 years, how do you see the concept of belonging evolve? How do you see the needs for employees and organizations evolve? What does the next 5 years of this work look like?
What I hope it looks like, I should say, is that it is a place where people don't have to sacrifice who they are to be themselves. I think part of braving the workplace is being yourself every day in a world that tells you to be something else. So I'm hoping that the workplace in 5 years is more representative of your towns and the people on the streets. That's a really aspirational goal I have for the workplace. And I also hope that people can understand themselves a little better and don't feel as pressured to be all of the things, all of the shoulds, the coulds, and the woulds that the rest of the world would like us to be.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. You talked about how leaders can create a sense of belonging. I'm curious about making teams more representative, our work environments are more representatives of the way that our towns
Yeah.
look like. Is there anything that you would have that a manager could do, a leader could do to say, I really want to make sure that I can start to achieve that now?
I think it's looking at your team and the diversity on your team. Are people in your meetings nodding their heads, or are they arguing comfortably with you? Are they debating? Do they speak up, or are they just laughing at your corny jokes? I think that's the things I listen to, at least. I think it's important to really be able to be in a team that communicates dissent.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to share experiences with one another. You're not going to share everything, and nor is it appropriate to share everything in the workplace. But there's certain life moments that we all have, and being able to comfortably speak to them at the appropriate level of detail is really important. And I think that's why people feel such a pull to go back to the office, because
Mm.
you those things without thinking about them. We always
Right.
joke around about the water cooler and talking about the latest episode of whatever you watch, but it goes deeper than that. It really does. It's a little harder to hide your emotions in an office,
Yeah. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
that's very acceptable. And that's what people miss. I think they miss that sense of camaraderie. And we don't necessarily need to be in person for that. We just need to understand how to break down barriers that are preventing us from doing that.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. Rapid round?
Yes, we're gonna do rapid round. And
Okay.
yes, I promise this is painless as
Okay.
much as possible. It's meant to be fun. Some of our best conversation happens here. And the goal is to answer pretty quickly, like your very first thought that comes to mind. And if you want to expound upon it, absolutely you can.
Okay.
So we'll leave that up to you. Sound good?
Perfect.
Okay. What is the best belonging initiative you've seen so far?
The best belonging initiatives I've seen so far is through Brene Brown, who talks about braving the wilderness and the ability to be yourself and the comfort and bravery to be yourself.
What does belonging mean to you personally in 3 words?
Don't sacrifice yourself.
Oh shit, that's
Oh,
good.
that's so good.
That's good. It's good. It's good. I see merch, Beth. I see a lot of merch happening. It's
What are the top 3 factors that make a community, and we see work as another kind of community, feel inclusive?
Well, inclusive is what other people allow for you to be versus belonging is what you decide for yourself.
Okay.
So if I'm talking about inclusive, I would say it's transparency. I would say it's care. And care is a really big spectrum, right? Care is thoughtfulness, and it's also speaking your name in a room of opportunity. And care can also be boundaries. And maybe I would go with boundaries now that we're talking about that as well. I think inclusive, having that level of boundaries promotes all the things we just spoke about.
And with that, because that was inclusiveness, now flip it with belonging. So, what are the top 3 factors that make a community feel like others belong?
Individuality. I'm going to go with care because we know care is the number one influence that a manager can do to make their employees feel like they belong. And trust.
Like it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Trusting ourselves and trusting others.
Yeah, it's the trusting yourself first, of course, so important, but it's
Really,
also trusting others too, and that everyone starts with positive intent.
that's right.
Yeah. If you could recommend one book, movie, article on this topic of belonging for
Mm.
something that's deeply resonated with you, and you're like, I need you to see that, read that, listen to that, what would you recommend to someone today?
It's a really tough one. Bell Hooks has a lot of phenomenal topics around belonging. Maya Angelou is probably my idol when it comes to this conversation because she presented belonging in the best, truest way. Belonging to nothing and everything at the same time is just magical when you can be that free to belong to nothing you belong to everything. So I'm going to go with bell hooks and Maya Angelou.
I love it. That's really powerful. When you belong to nothing, you belong to everything.
That's right.
If you could have every company
Mm.
do just one thing differently tomorrow, what would that be?
Get to know their employees and what matters to them.
How about leaders
The same.
and individuals?
If I could have one wand and I would wave it around, it would be for people to be kinder to themselves. It really would be. I think we put a lot of harsh, harsh words, harsh feelings out there. A lot of it just creates this crazy level of uncertainty and anxiety. And then a lot of the times, the exclusive nature of that is isolating and stressful. And that's a lot of the times we keep it to ourselves until it just boils over and you either explode or, unfortunately, all of the physical ramifications come into play because we know that this becomes physically painful when
Mhm.
we feel like we have a thwarted sense of belonging. And it's unfortunate, but belonging is an antecedent to suicide. When we feel like the world is better off without us, or we find that we don't believe we're making a difference for ourselves and others. So I would love to see people be kinder to themselves overall.
I think that's such a really good message. I'll share my best friend if I'm like down on myself, which I think we're all guilty of it, trying to
Yes.
get better at it. But it's the first, of course, you're your own worst critic. My best friend will say, "Hey, don't talk about my friend like that." Like,
Aw.
let me just stop. So I think it's just little things like when you're
Yes.
talking about yourself, be like, "Hey, don't talk about you like that." I think it's good. I
I love
thank you.
that.
Thank
Yes.
you so much for this and for your authenticity and for sharing all of this good research with us and tips with us on how to have better belonging at work. And we cannot wait to read your book when it comes out soon.
Thank you. And thank you for the phenomenal work you're doing on this podcast. I bet you people tune in and they just love it because you both seem like you're friends with the podcast guests. So I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can come over and say hi to us on the TikToks and LinkedIn community. Hit us up at yourworkfriends.com. We're always posting stuff on there. And if you found this episode helpful, share with your work friends.
Bye,
Thanks, friend.
friend.